freshwater wetland. Emerging technologies and the critical role of indigenous people and the local communities in wetland stewardship. I'm Tatiana Lobato, and with Yasmin Quintana, we will moderate this IUCN panel today.
Thank you, Tatiana. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Yasmin Quintana, and we are delighted to welcome our panelists. We have with us Marcos Valderrabano from the IUCN Secretariat and the Wetlands Ecosystem Programs, Luis Zambrano, international recognized freshwater ecologist at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. We have Gillian Davies, senior ecologist with the BCS Group, Society of Wetland Scientists, and a specialist in wetland policy and rights-based conservation. And we also have Marinus Otte, editor-in-chief of Wetlands and expert of wetland conservation. Thank you all for being here. And well, we're gonna have some time to discuss and learn about your experience. And I wanna start with an opening question for everyone. What do you see as the greatest challenge and greatest opportunity for freshwater wetland conservation over the next decade? We're going to start in the same order: Marcos, Luis, Gillian, and Marinus.
Thank you very much, Jasmine. Tatiana, thank you for organizing this. And thank you all the participants. So I'm Marcos Valderrabano. I come from the IUCN Secretariat. I am not a freshwater ecologist. I support a Red List Ecosystem program globally. So my view on the challenges and opportunities for freshwater come from a more generalistic ecology point of view. I think the biggest opportunities in the next 10 years is bringing freshwater conservation hand by hand with other ecosystems. What we've seen, at least from the point of view of Red List of ecosystems and assessing ecosystems in different countries, is that very often there is a dissociation between how do we treat terrestrial ecosystems and then freshwater ecosystems are here and then marine are over there. And now with a number of tools, including the Red List of ecosystem, which is the topic I'm going to be talking about, there is more and more bridges built across how do we understand ecosystems and how do we compare the risk and the situation and the perspectives going further. So I think there is a great opportunity in the next 10 years to building bridges between all these silos among the different administrations that we start treating biodiversity conservation as a whole. Yeah, I think that's a very exciting time at the moment in that sense. Thank you. Over to you, Yasmin.
Thank you, Marcos. Then now let's hear from Luis.
Okay, I think the next 10 years will face a lot of challenges, and challenges can help us to create new paths in order for conservation, particularly in wetlands. As Marcos said, the new exciting moments, it comes from trying to link terrestrial ecosystems to water ecosystems. I mean, the influence of terrestrial ecosystems to the water ecosystems that normally are below from the terrestrial ones. And this is a large challenge in terms of the need of water that civilization is getting at this moment. And it's more important in terms of the climate change. At least, for example, in my country, particularly in my city with 20 million people, we have a huge problem in terms of water management, and that is reflecting in the wetlands that we have in the city, because the lack of water in the wetlands is going stronger and stronger. So the opportunities are there. I mean, how we can link the city to the wetland and the protection of the wetland and the management of the wetland. And this is a very nice challenge. It's a very difficult challenge, but this is a very, very interesting challenge. And I would leave it in that point in order to have the rest of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. That's a very interesting point. And let's hear from Gillian.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for organizing this really great panel discussion and inviting me to be here. And in terms of a really great challenge and also opportunity, what I think of for freshwater ecosystems is how do we affect transformative change? There's a lot of transformative change out there, but how do we do it? And it's an opportunity and it's also a challenge. And shifting people's ethical and cultural framework and understanding of our relationship with nature and with wetlands and freshwater systems to a more ecocentric perspective rather than an anthropocentric perspective. The current paradigm that most society operates under is anthropocentric, where people are considered kind of separate and superior to nature. And that has led to the current over-extraction, the triple crisis that we're facing. And so that needs to be unraveled, and starting at the ground level with our understanding of the relationship. And that means, learning from indigenous people that we are interdependent with the rest of the web of life, and we're part of that web of life. And nature is living and it's sentient, and that we need to recognize the rights of wetlands and the rights of nature, the rights of freshwater ecosystems in our ethical system, which then can help shift our legal systems. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Gillian. That's very, very important. And now let's hear from Marinus.
Yes, first of all, thanks for inviting me, of course. Let me see how I see Gillian, but not myself. How is that? Anyway, if you can hear and see me, that's fine. I agree with everything that is said, but the thing that is not said is what, in my opinion, is the underlying reason of all of it. It's the size of the human population that is driving all this. Despite all kinds of protections and regulations around the world, wetlands, freshwater ecosystems in general have been decreasing in quality and in amount, surface area. Water quality has been decreasing around the world. Aquifers are being depleted. And we have no good solution. So we need to put all those things in perspective, but we need to really talk about the elephant in the room, is how do we deal with conservation of water in a world where the population is still increasing. It will decrease, but that'll be another lifetime away before we see that. In the meantime, we're still increasing the demand of fresh water per person on top of the number of people in the world growing. That is a hard conversation, and it's also politically really difficult, particularly in countries like the United States. In other places too. The Chinese are way better at understanding these things, but they have a different political system. And there, that discussion started a long time ago. But most of the world has to really look at this hard and see how we can deal with that. We cannot regulate the size of the human population, but we can talk openly about how that impacts on our water resources and hence on ecosystems. That's my 2 pennies worth to start off.
Thank you so much. And then I'll leave it to Tatiana.
Thank you for all the info comments from you all. We have now some questions about the red list of ecosystem, that it's one of the efforts that IUCN and the Commission of Ecosystem Management have been working through the past decade. So Marcos, we have these questions about this important global assessment framework that is the red list of ecosystem. Why it's important to develop a global red list of ecosystem assessment for freshwater ecosystem, and how could it help governments and the conservation practitioners?
Yeah, thank you, Tatiana. Well, I'm a bit biased on this question, but definitely I believe it's very important to develop the red list of ecosystem assess the risk of ecosystem collapse. We suspect that many of the freshwater ecosystems are going to be highly threatened only by observing the situation. But the challenge is, the reality is we don't know. And that when there is about 5,000 ecosystems that have been assessed globally, and only 3% of them are freshwater. That already gives an indication of how understudied they are at the moment. The challenge is that we don't know what we don't know, and that we suspect freshwater ecosystems are very likely going to be highly threatened and at high risk of collapse when we compare with the situation of terrestrial or marine ecosystems, but we don't really know. And that information would be essential for governments and countries in order to prioritize action, in order to identify which freshwater ecosystems are at higher risk, which ones require higher attention, what are the reasons that are driving those at risk, and then prioritize restoration and protection accordingly to those decisions. So it's basically a way of informing national action down the stream. But there is still a long way that we need to walk to get there.
And what is the biggest gaps in freshwater ecosystem assessment globally?
Well, the first one is that we have very little examples to drive from. Typically, the red list of ecosystems built from similar assessments that have been in similar ecosystems in other places of the world. And right now, we have very little examples. And I feel when someone in a country reach out to me and ask, oh, I want to do an assessment of this river in this part of the world, which indicators can I use? Suddenly, I'm a bit lost on what guidance to provide. So one thing is providing guidance. Now, there are some clear gaps on freshwater ecosystems that are going to be quite obvious for everyone, like data, for example. There is potentially less data on many freshwater systems than others. But there are some others that are less obvious. One is, for example, a scale. At which scale do we need to assess freshwater ecosystems and the challenges given on the dynamic component of the freshwater system, but also the continuity on how those freshwater systems create a continuum across from the top of the mountains to the sea, connecting rivers and the lakes and wetlands, and that creates a continuum across the landscape that we need to untangle and identify the relevant scales. And so those challenges and others are, for example, how do we address the fact that rivers are longitudinal instead of an area? And these type of challenges, more methodological, do have a solution. And we've seen that with the red list of threatened species that has been for a longer time, and there's been small adaptations and ways in which the red list of threatened species is applied for freshwater species. Now, similar approaches need to happen for red list of ecosystems, and no doubt we will see significant progress in the next 5 to 10 years, no doubt about it.
And in this context, how can the red list of ecosystem accommodate the diversity of freshwater wetlands to monitoring the data available worldwide with all these gaps? And how can Specialist Group could contribute to expand the freshwater ecosystem assessments globally?
So at the moment, for assessing ecosystems, we are very much using as a reference the IUCN Global Ecosystem Typology. That's quite adapted globally as the reference hierarchical classification, under which we then nest national or local classifications under that. That provides a simple framework that allows gathering expertise around particular ecosystem functional groups on or type of ecosystems. Now, at the moment, we are working with the Commission and several expert groups trying to provide a feasibility plan going forward, in particular to assess rivers and lakes, and use that feasibility plan as a fundraising process to start generating some knowledge. Now, experts in the Commission would be really welcome to join this thinking process that we are right now in the process of doing, and then mobilizing that data set and knowledge expertise into concrete red list of ecosystem assessments in the future. So please stay tuned. There is no doubt that we need to put a strong emphasis on freshwater ecosystem in the next 5 to 10 years to cover that significant gap. And I think mobilizing the expertise present in IUCN would be essential to make a success of that process. So stay tuned, and we hope to get further concrete engagement process soon. Thank you, Tatiana.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very important to this linkage across groups through the UCN and with the commissions, and hopefully more people join these efforts, and more countries also support to get in the freshwater assessment per nationality and different scales. That could be very, very important. Thank you very much, Marcos. We'll continue with the same topic with wetlands and monitoring, but change a bit the perspective with Luis Zambrano and Yasmin.
Thank you, Tatiana. Now we want to hear from you, Luis, from your experience working with freshwater ecosystems in Mexico. How do local and global conservation priorities align or conflict?
Well, well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I didn't say that in the beginning because I was so hurried to try to explain very fast everything. So thank you very much. I think the local challenges, at least from my experience, is that the lack of understanding, mostly from the local governments, of how important are the wetlands and the freshwater ecosystems. It's funny, but well, it's not funny, it's sad, basically, that most of the local governments and even local societies, I mean, our society, think that rivers are a problem in generating, for example, mosquito threats and diseases. And instead of seeing the rivers or the wetlands as an opportunity place for increasing the water quality, even in terms of using the ecosystem in order to help us to reduce the problems in terms of water, supplying water or inundations. Actually, we have a huge problem of floods now in Mexico City because, as you may know, we used to live in a huge lake. I mean, Mexico City is based on a huge lake, and now we dry out everything. So in normal storms like these ones that has happened in the last few weeks, we have had a lot of problems in terms of flooding. Therefore, the important thing about it is how the people see that. I mean, when you see a flood, instead of thinking that you have to have a healthy wetland, for example, in order to reduce the problems of floods, the thing is to hate the wetlands because they assume that they generate this type of problems. So the most important problems locally, at least from my experience here in Mexico, is that we don't understand how work with nature instead of work against nature. And that has been a problem since the colony. We have had this problem for 400 years. So that is one of the huge challenges. Internationally, I think that since there are many examples of different types of water, I was I'm trying to think in how we create, for example, a general assessment for every type of water systems. And there is a huge difference from different type of water, and a huge difference in terms of perturbation of this water. I mean, we have eutrophication in one side, we have destruction of the food webs in other side, we have overfishing in the other side. So we have huge different problems in huge different heterogeneous type of wetlands or freshwater systems. So to create an assessment in short and long term is really, really challenging. So one of the problems that I see in, for example, in terms of international is to try to accommodate all these type of different wetlands with different dynamics that reacts very, very fast in one or two types of assessments. Those are the things that I am thinking is very, very challenging. So I will leave this answer here, and I hope that that I answered a little bit the question.
Yes, thank you, Luis. And it's is like the setup for the next question I have about indicators. What indicators do you consider most useful for monitoring freshwater ecosystems based on like that complexity and all those differences?
Well, from my ecologist, I mean, I am biased in terms of I am very hardcore ecologist. So one of the things that I normally measure, for example, to understand any freshwater system is obviously the the physical-chemical things in the water, for example, oxygen and oxygen, pH, nutrients dissolved. Those are the basic to start to understand the water system, not how it is, but the water system at all. Because one of the things that we faced, for example, in Mexico, is that most of the water systems here are naturally eutrophied, which means that they have a lot of nutrients. And normally people think that it's very important to have very, very small amount of nutrients. And in many of these lakes or wetlands are highly eutrophied. But we have to understand in which position are these wetlands. And the second thing that I normally try to understand is more than the biodiversity, the food-wet composition. If we understand the food-wet composition, then we can have a very nice network to understand how the species that we want to conserve are placed in that area, and then how we have to modify the food-wet composition in order to preserve the species that we want to preserve. And the last one is the amount of the exotic species, and which is at least here we have 95% of the water bodies in Mexico country have at least one exotic fish, like carp or tilapia, for example. So the amount of exotic fish are highly important in order to generate this large assessment. Those are, in general terms, the things that I would focus in terms of assessment.
Thank you, Luis. And then my last question about this topic is how can conservation science become more relevant to decision makers? Are there successful examples of freshwater restoration that offers lessons globally that can convince them?
Globally, yes. I mean, I've seen a lot of very, very nice articles in science that help us has helped to local governments to understand how they have to modify the water system, the food web, etc., etc. So science has been really, really important in many places. There are other places that is not exactly as important in general terms, that political things are a little bit more important than science, and that science is used only if they are aligned to the political desires of the local government, in which it has been very, very important is with local people. My experience is that we create a very nice knowledge about how the wetland is working. We don't go to the government, we go to the local people, and the local people, and we create a very nice connection with them, and they give the information that they think it is necessary, and we give the information we think is necessary. So we create this very nice link to modify and restore wetlands. That has helped a lot, but I am really, really disappointed with local governments, at least from my side of the world.
Thank you, Luis. Yeah, that's very important, and it's interesting to see how important local actions and local people is for conservation of wetlands. And now Tatiana is gonna address some questions about new technologies and emerging tools.
Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you, Luis. Very, very interesting, the comment about the importance that the local community given to science. And in this context, we have a lot of new technologies now that we can use in our favor for conserving freshwater wetlands. So I move with some questions to Marinus about these technologies, and particularly looking from his experience and has been editor-in-chief of the wetland for more than 1 decade. He received and read a lot of papers, so all of kind of topics. And these recent technologies such as the environmental DNA, remote sensing, artificial intelligence, and citizen science, as Luis mentioned now, are transforming how we conserve our ecosystem and how we monitor this freshwater ecosystem. So, Marinus, from your perspective, how do you think new technologies can complement the traditional ecological knowledge and the field monitoring? And what are the limitations of you rely on these emerging technologies?
Yeah, thank you, Tatiana, for that question. Excuse me. There are major developments you mentioned eDNA, also in remote sensing and GIS approaches. And what I see there is that these new technologies come in and studies are done to use these really as a survey technology initially. So mapping wetlands in more detail. Can we, with remote sensing, can we pick up on the smaller ecosystems? eDNA, turns out there are way more organisms of any group you can imagine when you use eDNA to survey water. I know from my own experience years ago, when I was still in Ireland, I wrote a review paper about fungi in marine ecosystems. And the conclusion was that we really knew only a few species and maybe there weren't that many fungi. Then already early approaches to eDNA came in and showed that in fact there are 1,000 species per cubic meter of seawater. We just don't know all but 2 of them. And they're not culturable. And that gets me to the next point. With eDNA, we can show the number of species in a group, perhaps, provided we have the database to check against that, how what we find links to what we know. And so we are still, in terms of eDNA, we are bashing our head against the wall, understanding how, yes, we have 1,000 species of a particular group, but which species are they? Do they have a name even? Do we know how they live, their biology, how they reproduce, what they eat? And for many, we don't, which goes back to an earlier comment about us needing to know much more about the food webs and how species interact. So as far as eDNA is concerned, we're still at the early stages. And the massive effort that is needed is to be able to create the library so that we can actually link these things together and talk more about functional groups, functionality, and how species are involved. If I go back to the remote sensing and GIS approaches, there what we see is that already there are more efforts to link, say, changes in land use and land cover to societal changes, to how wetlands are used by humans. People bring in all kinds of other perspectives, if you will, where GIS remote sensing is a tool that helps answer questions that are maybe much more important than just how many wetlands do we have where. And so as far as the journal is concerned, right now we have come to a point where we start rejecting papers, particularly about GIS remote sensing, that don't take it further than just here's another map. So that's where we're at. We need to change, or we need to know more about what it actually means. And like I said, the similarity between eDNA and remote sensing is that they're both tools. Now we need to understand what it all means. So I think that is the biggest challenge for anybody, really, and it will require a lot of money. And that means politicians who understand that this is needed. So no easy solution there.
Yeah, definitely. Also improving how to use these technologies in a good manner. In this context, do you foresee environmental DNA becoming a standard tool within global ecosystem assessment?
Oh, absolutely. It's just such a cool tool. It's just exciting if we just use it to, like I said earlier about the marine fungi, the fact that we now know that, we know only of a few species, and at the time, and I'm not going back very far, 25 years ago, the thinking was we can only, there are only marine fungi on flotsam and jetsam, as it's called. These are substrates for fungi to grow on because there's no substrate in the ocean. Now we know that that is absolute nonsense. There are many, many, many species out there, and they use substrates that we never knew. I think that eDNA is going to be a very important tool. Maybe it already is, and will be here as a good assessment of biodiversity. And then as we develop other tools, if you will, to understand the link, if we create the libraries, if we can have better mechanisms of measuring functionality away from the more traditional ways, that would help. At the same time, what I see a lot at the moment from the Global South particularly, many studies that go back to techniques and approaches that are 20, 30 years old because there is no money to buy the equipment for these new tools. That is, again, something we can advise on as a group maybe, but that is politically and economically driven and hard to change. So I see, for instance, in pollution, more and more papers still coming about metals. That was done 30 years ago. We know metals are bad, but they're actually not the most poisonous things on Earth. The technologies to study other pollutants are there, but who can afford them? If your inflation is more than 100% in countries like, it has changed now, I think, but like Argentina, it's that, these problems are really difficult to overcome, and all we can do is advise and provide information. But a long answer to your question, eDNA is here to stay, and it's going to be much more powerful than it already is, I think.
No, thank you very much, Marinus. You already answered my next question.
There you go.
That it's about how the barriers for developing countries to use these technologies. But I think many of these barriers can also be applied for all countries around the world.
Absolutely.
A lot of novelty within artificial intelligence and the other tools that you have now that we are facing this challenge globally.
Yeah, don't get me started on artificial intelligence. I mean, but in combination with eDNA, maybe. No, yeah, so why I was mentioning the Global South, you're right, it's around the world, but countries that have very high inflation rates, one thing I learned about and never thought about, Bolivia is in that situation at the moment. I'll be there in a month. Argentina, other countries. You write a proposal, you put in a budget, by the time it's approved, you only have 50% of the value left. Therefore, the machine you applied for, you can't actually buy, but you're not allowed to put in the proposal that you build in existing inflation rates, because that is politically unacceptable. How we solve that, I don't know.
No, thank you very much, Marinus. We are now moving a little bit to the topic with Gillian and Yasmin. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. Yes, I think talking about the global south, we also have to consider how important it is to talk about wetland rights, other types of conservation, and indigenous stewardship. So, Gillian, you have a lot of experience on this topic, and we would like to know what progress have been made globally in recognizing and protecting wetland rights.
Okay. Well, thank you, Yasmin. And the good news is there's been a lot of progress in the last few years in advancing rights of wetlands. And I just thought, for those who might be new to this concept, for one thing, we use the definition of wetlands, that's the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands definition, which includes water bodies and waterways. So all rivers, lakes are wetlands, as well as the traditionally understood vegetated wetlands, and forested wetlands are also part of it, as are coastal wetland systems such as mangroves and salt marshes, but also coral, which a lot of people don't know. So I just thought I'd mention that. And just really quickly, there's a global rights of nature that's been going on, really picking up steam since the early 2000s. And so rights of wetlands is in that context, a sort of subset of that. And rights, there are 8 specific rights that will help all wetlands to exist, to thrive or flourish, and to participate in Earth's natural processes in a regenerative way. So the right to regenerate. And that ties into the larger rights of nature thinking, which is that those are kind of fundamental rights that all of nature has due to its intrinsic value and membership in the Earth community, not because they're valuable to humans, which is different from how they've been treated. It's just, are these ecosystems valuable to people or not? And often wetlands and waterways and water bodies have been thought of wastelands, at best drinking water supplies, or that sort of thing. And so that's where rights of wetlands comes in, is helping to change how people think. And some of the other speakers have touched on that local communities and governments don't really understand the value of the wetlands. So one thing rights of nature can do, and rights of wetlands can do, is shift the fundamental understanding that we're not separate from the wetlands. Ourselves and our well-being are intimately connected with the health and well-being of the wetlands. And so that's the kind of, and that ties into how a lot of indigenous people relate to nature, which is we're all part of the web of life. Other elements of nature are our kin, and nature is living and sentient. And now research is showing there's a lot more sentience in nature than people had than the Western science model had understood. Trees communicate below ground, et cetera, et cetera. I won't get sidetracked into that. In terms of progress, there's a researcher, Craig Kaufman, who is one of the authors of the Eco-Jurisprudence Monitor, which is an online tracker for rights of nature initiatives. And what he's found is that out of 271 ecosystem-specific rights of nature initiatives that were documented as of April this year, 213 are wetlands focused, which is wonderful. It's fascinating because it's showing how central wetlands, including the really aquatic wetlands like rivers and other waters. And a lot of those initiatives are actually rights of rivers initiatives, because there's a big rights of rivers movement. And there are declarations of the rights of rivers, there are declaration of the rights of wetlands. And so rights of nature is a beautiful tool for people concerned with freshwater ecosystems, because organically already the communities and governments that are generating rights of nature initiatives are already heavily focused on freshwater wetlands and also coastal wetlands. But I think that's a big leg up for this increased awareness about the importance of freshwater ecosystems. And in addition, we've just finished a 3-year project which was led by Cobra Collective and Wetlands International. It was in 5 global South countries: Ecuador, Guyana, Bolivia, Sri Lanka, and Kenya, to explore the implementation of rights of wetlands. And one thing that came out of that are a lot of tools. So if there are communities and governments that want to implement rights of wetlands, we now have toolkits and trainings that are available on the Rights of Wetlands website. They're free and downloadable for anybody. And then the third area of progress is we have an ongoing effort within the context of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands to advance rights of wetlands at the international multilateral environmental agreement level through that convention. And Sri Lanka is taking the lead on proposing a draft resolution on rights of wetlands. So making progress there, and hopefully that will be brought to the COP in Panama in 2028, the next Ramsar Convention on Wetlands COP. So, and I will put links to both the Eco-Jurisprudence Monitor and the Rights of Wetlands website in the chat when I have a minute. So, yeah.
Thank you, Gillian. I was gonna suggest exactly that, sharing the links with the participants, because this is a very interesting model. It's pretty new and it moves away from the traditional model, and I think we all should learn more about this. But of course, being so new, there are some barriers and some challenges. So what barriers remain for implementing right-based conservation approaches? And how can organizations such as the IUCN and the Society of Wetland Scientists support this agenda?
How can organizations like IUCN support this agenda? Well, we have a Rights of Wetlands Initiative group that's already connecting with IUCN, so that's wonderful. And thank you for anybody on this call. I see Ian Harrison here, who's we've connected with Ian. And I think connecting with IUCN very proactively is one really key thing, so that we can all work together as we've been discussing by email and things. Yes, and Ian just put in the IUCN resolution on living in harmony with rivers through rights of nature and ecocentric law, which was a big accomplishment. So I'd say IUCN is already really active on this, and we just would like to do more of that collaboration and connection. And I think what we can do collectively is to address this education thing with communities and governments, and also through the multilateral environmental agreements at Convention on Biological Diversity, as well as the Ramsar Convention and others. So I think those are the ways that we can collaborate. And was there any part of that question I didn't answer yet?
The challenges to implement
The
that.
challenges. Okay. So challenges, I think the biggest challenge is that the Western or modern society paradigm views nature as a commodity and we have a lot of extractive industries with vested interest and a lot of power and a lot of money, and are driven by a profit motive of seeing wetlands and other natural resources and as a natural resource instead of a web of life. And so I think even for ourselves, we've been conditioned to talk about natural resources. Well, let's change our language and talk about the web of life the way indigenous people do. And there's kind of a linguistic chain from, web of life, natural resources. Natural resources, once they've been gathered, become commodities. Commodities become products. Products become profit. And I think understanding those connections and deconstructing them and trying to shift language and thinking more towards the web of life. And I think that's what Rights of Nature does. And I just finished reading a very revealing book called The World for Sale. And I would recommend it for there's some journalists researched people who trade the world's natural resources and turn them into commodities. And that's a very interesting link to start to see and understand. And I think that's a really big challenge. But I think, again, rights of nature and rights of wetlands is a great way to combat it because it changes how people think and the language that we use.
Thank you so much, Gillian. And to complement this, I wanted to ask Marinus, what have you learned from your work that demonstrates the value of indigenous stewardship in wetland conservation?
Yeah, so I travel a lot and I got early exposure, like in my early 20s with indigenous people in Malaysia, the Orang Asli there. That opened my eyes to other ways of thinking. Then traveling in other places, I visited a tribe in Ecuador, the Achuar, who are intrinsically connected to the river and have a very different way of thinking. And now, more recently, I work with the tribe here in the United States, the Turtle Mountain tribe of Chippewa Indians, who have land on the border with Canada in northern North Dakota. And they have some linkage to the thinking in terms of rights of nature, but they have also been influenced a lot by Western people who colonized North Dakota. Many people from Northern Europe, from Germany, from Scandinavia moved there with very Orthodox Christian beliefs, and that has infiltrated their thinking. So they're people that live more traditionally, that are truly intrinsically linked to water, have retained that thinking as not just about water, of course, it's about any ecosystem. But people who have been influenced a lot by, for want of a better term, Western thinking, have some of that maybe as a remnant, but have lost it. I think that the idea of the rights of wetlands is very important, and particularly when it comes to education, to the way we talk about the rights of wetlands. With the tribe here in the US, I started with the idea that we could maybe use the rights of wetlands for actual legal protection of wetlands. And I've come back from that because the way it is phrased doesn't hold up to modern legal systems as they exist in the United States anyway. It doesn't have clout. And so they have, for instance, a water code that talks about Nibi, which is water. In Ojibwe is the source of all life. And there's a whole background story of how life started on Earth, how nature was created on Earth. And it's a beautiful story, but it's written in the legal code of water protection, which even according to their own lawyers has no standing in court. So we have a long way to go there. Like I said, I think the rights of wetlands as an idea is very good. It needs to be part of education. It needs to change how we talk about nature. And for that, we can certainly look at indigenous tribes, but we also need to think about the reality, which is that 80% of people on Earth live in cities that have lost most connection with nature. I always use the example from my own language in Dutch, and it's also the case in some other language, where in Dutch, you don't talk about nature, you talk about the nature. That little article in front of nature completely changes your connection. In English, I can say, I live with nature. When I say, I am concerned about the nature, it's separate from me. And so the Dutch go for a walk, for instance, in the nature. They don't live in the nature. They go for a walk in the nature, which is a park. So if we can convey some of that thinking from indigenous people in our language to educate people who don't live in such an environment, that would be very helpful.
Thank you, Marinus. And knowing the importance of integrating indigenous knowledge, what are the risks when this knowledge is excluded from conservation planning?
Well, what happens then is that you basically ignore the human dimension of wetlands. That is now a term that I see quite a bit, is that there is talk about wetlands and the human dimension. Some of it goes simply back to using wetlands, water in general, as resources. And so that is just going back to the way people have been thinking about how nature is used as a resource. It's also, in the United States particularly, it also comes from the mostly Christian background of immigrants here. If you go back to the late 1800s or before that, which brought with them this idea that nature is for us to use, not to be part of. And it's not just Christian thinking, and you see it in other religions as well. But as an example, here in this part of the United States, that is a very strong way of thinking that is really, really hard to move away from. If I go to a little bar in central North Dakota, when I'm on field work, I go to places like that. I go to a little bar in the community of 300 people, and I start talking to people over a beer, and you realize when you are able to have a good conversation that thinking that we are actually part of nature, even in those small communities, which here are farming, oil extraction, and agriculture. Sorry, that's the same as farming, but to make that link that we are part of it is very, very hard, which goes back to my earlier comment that if it's integrated in education, we might get somewhere. But you're up against all kinds of cultural and religious aspects that are hard to break through.
Yeah, it's too complex and
yeah,
really difficult to incorporate in policies. But do you know if there are policy frameworks that have successfully integrated conservation and indigenous rights together?
Well, Ecuador is a famous example. Ecuador incorporated it in their constitution. Even there, it's being challenged. Here in the United States, there's an indigenous group called the White Earth Band of Chippewa Indians, I think they're called, White Earth Nation anyway. They are related to the Turtle Mountain Band that I work with, the larger group of Ojibwe. They incorporated in their tribal law the rights of Manoman. Manoman is the term for wild rice, which is not rice, it's a different grass of the genus Zizania, which is traditionally harvested in Minnesota. And they wrote it into their constitution to apply not just to what is called their reservation, but to the original treaty lands, which is a much larger area. But there too, this is now being challenged in court by people that are not indigenous, that, for instance, need the water for growing potatoes, and it's a big business. And it doesn't look good for that law as far as its application is concerned outside the actual boundaries of the White Earth Reservation. So you see enormous pushback. And in Ecuador, maybe Gillian can speak to that as well, because she has been working there with another tribe. But I think there too, the rights of nature, even though it's part of their constitution, is being challenged. So it's a steep way up.
Was there?
Yes, Gillian.
Yeah. Thanks, Marinus. So you're right that the rights of nature are recognized in Ecuador's constitution, and the country has gone through a learning process. And over time, the trend has been that more court cases are being won as the judiciary, all those judges, become educated as to what rights of nature are. So initially, they didn't understand it very well, and more of the cases were lost. But as they became educated about it, they understood how the case should actually be ruled for rights of nature. And indigenous people had a huge influence on the development of the Constitution. And the group that I and the Rights of Wetlands Initiative folks collaborate with is the Quechua original people of Sariaku, or the Sariaku. And they, even before we started collaborating with them and before we drafted the Rights of Wetlands Declaration, they had a declaration on the living forest, which declared their area of the Amazon forest as a living rights and intertwined it with their indigenous rights. So it's a declaration of biocultural rights. I think that's a real synergy. And then we had, over a couple of years, really, we had conversations with some of their elders and leaders, and just shared knowledge and built trust. And then we developed a joint declaration of the Quechua original peoples of Sariaku and the scientists and policy specialists. There was to try to braid our two knowledge systems together and to speak with a louder voice by putting our voices together. And the Sariaku made their statement, and then we looked in the scientific literature for literature that would support their cosmovision and their view of nature, that it's living and sentient. And we found lots of literature to support that. And that declaration is on the Rights of Wetlands, or well, our joint declaration is on the Rights of Wetlands website, and I'll put a link to that page in the chat as well. And I'll put one into the Sariaku's Declaration of the Living Forest. So.
Thank you so much, Gillian. And I think now it's time to to start with the cross-cutting questions. So I leave Tatiana to lead.
Thank you, Yasmin. What amazing experiences shared by Gillian and Marinus with the indigenous community. Now we have some open questions for any of our four speakers who want to pick up that. The first is, where do you see the greatest opportunities for collaborating between scientists, indigenous communities, local communities, and NGOs and governments?
Sorry, who were you Sorry, I was typing in the chat. Who did you specifically ask that of?
It's open for any of, if you
Okay.
want to pick up, Gillian, but it's open for
actually,
any of you for.
I'll let one of the others take it, and I'll finish what I'm writing in the chat.
Okay, I guess I have to think about that a bit. The greatest opportunities, I think, wherever it is, Gillian gave a good example. The rights of wetlands is incorporated in the Constitution of Ecuador. The lawyers and judges in court cases need to get used to the idea. This is also why I started recently working with tribes in the United States, because I realized that such a change of thinking would never come from the federal government, certainly not the current clowns in the White House. It would never come easily from state government, but it would come from the tribes, which have some level of autonomy depending on which tribe and how the agreements were shaped. If it comes from there, you can maybe start building that into other mechanisms of protection. The NGOs could, more than they probably do, jump on board, and all kinds of other organization, whether for profit or not, could work with the tribes to make changes. And again, I'm talking from my experience here in the United States. In other countries, it may be a different situation. For example, to an extreme different situation, if central government in China would adopt the thinking of the rights of nature, it would be instantly implemented across 1.4 billion people. But in the United States, it has to come from indigenous people working with the NGOs, who then might be able to change things at the state level. And an interesting one there is South Dakota, which has more land under tribal land than non-tribal state land. And North Dakota is not far behind those states that could actually happen there. So that is my thinking. Gillian, or others?
Yeah, I could add to that. I think that's some good thinking that the academics who've thought about how rights of nature is functioning or not functioning in the world, one key question is, what is your political situation? Is it open or closed? So in Ecuador, it was an open environment because there was the opportunity to rewrite the Constitution. In the US, at the national level, it's considered closed because we're not on the brink of passing national rights of nature laws. However, when that higher level is closed, you can still work at lower levels of governance, and you can still work to change the culture and the ethics in communities. So in the US, there are actually of rights of nature movements, something like, I think, over 180 are going on in the US at the county and local municipal level. And there are also two ways to approach it. One pathway is it gets hashed out in courts. And so you something, and just by the way you write it, it winds up lawsuits, and then it gets hashed out in the court system. That's one pathway. Another pathway proactive, and that can be incorporating it into local bylaws and planning documents and ordinances and things, and being sort of very thoughtful where you're kind of proactively implementing it as opposed to waiting for the legal conflicts to happen. And then that reduces the number of times it goes to court. And there's a county in California that has done that very successfully, and I've forgotten which county that is. So yeah, thinking about very consciously, if you want to implement this stuff, thinking where are the opportunities, is it at which governance level? And that's why we're pursuing the Convention on Wetlands, because if we can get something in at that multilateral level, even though it's not a law, it will get the idea of rights of nature into hopefully the thinking of all the contracting parties. There are 172 countries that are signatory to that treaty. So that could have a very big impact. So, yeah.
Could I jump in a little bit in terms of my experience? One of the things that I've been working, is to local people, which is basically indigenous people in urban areas. So that is a very strange challenge, because the indigenous people here in urban areas has a mix in tradition in one way, and traditional things, and the modern society in the other way. So one of the challenges here is to try to understand the traditional parts from a very Occidental vision or urban vision of how to work with nature sources, particularly wetlands. We have seen very interesting things in terms of the relation between local people or indigenous people and the government in all Latin America, because we started to work with different projects in terms of nature-based solutions in all Latin America. And we saw that indigenous peoples have worked in their own way against, or not against, but trying to match the policies of the Western people or the urban people, or the people that manage the city. So it's very interesting to see how, if the manager creates a policy about nature things within the city, the indigenous people takes that and manage and change it a little bit in order to fit with the traditional things, and has very interesting ways, because also, since they have had a lot of more information in terms of the history of that ecosystem, they create a new ways to approach to these scientific or Western values about ecosystems, and create their own way of manage that ecosystem. So it is highly interesting. And the only thing that we have to think about that is to respect the knowledge of the indigenous people, which in urban areas is very, very difficult, from the science, from the NGOs, and from the managers of the city. So once you understand everything about this link and these goals from every part of the society, in urban society, then we can create progress in terms of the management of the area, particularly in wetlands, which are really, really a high valuable resource. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. And I have another open question for you four. If you had only one recommendation for governments seeking to improve freshwater wetland conservation, what would it be?
To me, would be work with nature and not against nature, basically.
For me,
well,
go ahead, Marinus. Okay.
No, you go first, Gillian.
To adopt a rights of nature framework for decision making. It would change how they made decisions.
So to me, it would be to get a law to specifically protect wetlands. Full stop. Wetlands, I often get manuscripts and they start, almost every other one, as if you have to tell wetland scientists. Wetlands are among the most important ecosystems on Earth. And I make the point, it's not among, they are the most important ecosystems on Earth. It's not necessarily rivers and lakes, it is wetlands. And the reason I say that is not from a perspective of biodiversity, but from the perspective that wetlands are the only wet ecosystem on land that clean our water. In other words, all these other ecosystems depend on wetlands. If you protect wetlands, they take out the pollutants. They provide habitat, yes, but they take out the pollutants. That is the important part. It cleans our water. If you protect the wetlands, full stop, whatever approach through traditional legal means or the rights of wetlands included, then you make a huge impact on the quality of your environment. And there are examples. The first country in the world to have a specific law to protect wetlands was South Korea, 1999, I think. Others followed suit, and maybe most extensive is the 2022 law that was enacted by the People's Republic of China. That one specifically, it has an adjustment to the Ramsar Convention. It excludes rice paddies, fish farms, and salt pans because that is agriculture, and you cannot have natural wetlands replaced by rice paddies and call it the same. That to me is the utmost needs globally, is to protect wetlands, have a good definition of what they are. The Chinese example is a good one. And if we would do that, we would go a long way protecting all other water, partly because of what was mentioned earlier, namely that they are connected to other waterways. And so if you start there, then you start protecting watersheds, you start protecting much more. So.
Yeah, that's excellent. I adhere to that. That would be fantastic. If we imagine an optimistic scenario where that could happen, that would also be my recommendation. Now, if we lower the expectations of our capacity to influence the policymakers, and we assume that there is going to be a little bit of conservation, a little bit of protection, a little bit of restoration, a little bit of threat mitigation, and we are going to continue in that the scenario of diverse activities here and there, then I think my advice probably would be think in the system and then try to address the biggest gaps instead of cherry picking tiny things that, if you look at the entire thing, are less relevant. And that's especially important for wetlands where there might be a particularly relevant intervention that would affect the entire system, whatever that's water quality or sediment supply, whatever that is in that case, that it's especially meaningful compared to the others. Now, the good thing is that now the tools that we have in terms of technology or remote sensing, eDNA, AI to integrate all these different data together, it's so powerful that we are much more equipped than we've ever been. So the moment is now, and think system. That would be my advice then.
And if I may follow up, Marcos, thanks for that comment. The way it worked in China was because they did not come necessarily from the perspective of biodiversity, even though that was an important one, but it was water quality and the impacts on humans. Biodiversity second, they were very concerned about losing the cranes, which are iconic in Chinese culture. But the water quality affected so many people, it was so bad that they somehow convinced the politicians to put that law in place. And the impact is huge. How it will develop from here on is another matter.
Well, thank you, everyone. All very important comments and highly complementary. I think if you pick up these 4 answers and work together to get more wetland freshwater conservation, that would be a wonderful thing to work on, with governments. And through the Wetland Ecosystem Specialist Group from the Commission of Ecosystem Management, that would be, we are more than open to collaborate and through this agenda. To give an opportunity for our audience to provide also some questions, I will move into Yasmin to coordinate in these questions with the public. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tatiana, and everyone. We have a lot of comments and a couple of questions. So I'm gonna start with the questions. When can we expect eDNA metabar coding to be harmonized standard in part of the freshwater ecosystem management in the EU WFD for biological monitoring? Can someone?
I don't know.
Me neither. I mean, I've been working with the eDNA, DNA about 3 years, and we have faced a lot of challenges in terms of the library, in terms of the amount of species that they don't work there, that they are not there, but they appeared in the standards and the samples. So, from my point of view, would be like 5 to 10 years to have a very proper and standardized test. However, I mean, I can't create any prediction since science is working really, really fast in some ways, but in others is a little bit slower.
Just to complement something through this question, for the biological monitoring, particularly for endangered species and exotic species that could be highly invasive, could be very useful now, because for these species we have a lot of genetic information and genomic information as well. So we've been starting Trojan and standard for monitoring globally, focusing in certain groups of species. That could be a first approach for monitoring in large scales.
And I have a comment from Ian to complement this. He's saying that he agrees with Marinus on eDNA. It's frequently included as a silver bullet solution to biodiversity assessment in grant proposals, but without consideration of whether the reference database will allow the results to be meaningful interpret. So I think we first have to analyze what are the gaps and prioritize what kind of information do we need to obtain first. There is another question from Andres. How can we harness knowledge and emerging technologies to raise awareness among decision makers and promote more effective and biodiversity inclusive water resource management?
If I may, I think that's really a question about how scientific knowledge becomes established as truth and then incorporated in systems at government levels and elsewhere. I talk about this sometimes in publication workshops. When somebody publishes an article in a scientific journal, then that needs to be verified by other studies, etc., etc. Long story short, it takes 10 years for a new idea to show up finally in textbooks and then to actually filter through to government. So I don't know how that can be done faster other than organizations like the IUCN and others doing their work. And avenues through the United Nations, for instance, would be helpful as well.
Thank you so much, Marinus. If someone else wants to add anything.
Yeah, well, certain countries have avenues to ensure that process it's faster with scientific advisory groups that directly link to the legislators. And I know, for example, Australia does that. They have particular scientific groups that are part of the legislative groups. So it depends on some countries are much slower than others, that's for sure. Now, whether a particular country wants to speed up the process and wants to put in place a system like this, that's another story. Now, how to accelerate the countries so that that system gets done, that's a different story. So the mechanism for accelerating that process exists. Now, how to make sure that the particular countries have those in place, that's I don't know how to do.
Thank you, Marcos. I think just for the sake of time, I'm gonna just mention one last comment from Flavia Rocha. She's saying that the separation between water resources as a productive asset and freshwater ecosystems as a habitat for biodiversity is reflected in policy and legislation. And I think that that's very important, and we need to change that. So Tatiana, I think, yeah, I let
Yes,
you.
we have now for 1 minute to answer. What's the for all four participants? We can follow in this order, and there are Marcos, Luis, Gillian, and Marinus. What is in single most important action that the global conservation community should prioritize to improve the future of freshwater wetlands? It could be one word or one small sentence. The most single important action to conserve freshwater wetlands. We can start with Marcos. Sorry, I think you are muted, Marcos.
I'm just trying to figure out what is the most important idea that we've said today. I cannot think of anything that we have not said already. Pass it over to the next speaker and see if I get a bit of inspiration right now. We've been quite thorough in this conversation.
I mean, I can say something, but I don't. I am not quite sure because this question is very, very difficult to address in very short time. But the first thing that I thought in terms of what is the single thing is to address the heterogeneity of the wetlands and the cultures that are around these wetlands. If we can understand that any wetland is very, very important and different from the other wetlands, so our approach has to be a little bit different from the other ones. And also the approach is considering not only the biological or ecological part, but also the cultural interaction with the local people. That would be very, very important in the next few years. That hasn't been addressed before. That is my 10 cents.
Perfect. Gillian?
Hi, yeah, I agree with Marcos that we've kind of covered the ideas, but I would say to affect truly transformative change, which means not just doing more of the same or a little bit more, or another good project or another good idea, but really thinking, how do we fundamentally shift the cultural and ethical understanding to become more ecocentric, and how do we scale up wetland freshwater ecosystem conservation and restoration, which probably means leveraging significantly more funding, working collaboratively, and integrating futures thinking analysis into our decision making. And I'm going to put a link to an article that just came out in the Wetlands Journal that Marinus and Tatiana have been or are editors for, so they've had their hand in this, and I think it was a really interesting article. I've never seen futures thinking analysis applied specifically to wetlands before, so I will put a link to that article, and yeah, that's what I would say. So.
Yeah, so to me, and it's a bit like, as we say, beating a dead horse, but the most important issue we have is education, but we need to do it in a different way. I've heard it a lot that academics all talk to each other and, they publish their articles, but they don't take it further. Well, that is because academics are really not suited for that. We're quite conservative by nature. What we need is to educate people through the means that work for them. And whether you like it or not, but that is the Instagram, TikTok, whatever the next platform is generation. And that is where probably we can do way better, not academics. I mean, I wouldn't know where to start, even though my son is on, excuse me, on Instagram, and I don't want to see his posts. But that younger generation in their now early 20s, that is who we need to catch to help us educate other people around the world. How we do it, I don't know. But that's what I think.
Thank you, Marinus. I don't know, Marcos, if you want to get the word again. No?
I think these last messages of education, system transformation, and transformative change, I think those are very nice words to finish with. Yeah.
No, thank you very much. Yes, I think that all very good messages. Understand really well the complexity of this ecosystem types and in wetland freshwater. To think different about the wetlands change the way that we understand these ecosystems and how to translate this knowledge to engage the next generations for conserving the freshwater wetlands around the world. Thank you very much, you all, to accept the invitation to participate today. I think that it was a very rising discussion, and thank you very, very much to you as our panelists for sharing your expertises, your insights. And on behalf of the Commission of Ecosystem Management, Wetlands Ecosystems Specialist Group, I would also like to thank all the participants and my co-moderator, Yasmin. We look forward to continue this kind of conversation and collaboration with you all. And thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.